Hi everybody, I'm Robert Rose. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer here at the Content Advisory. I hope you're all coping and dealing well in this very weird and extraordinary time. One of the things that we were asked to do recently was to put together a webinar. We've been managing remote teams for the last 10 years, and so we've become a bit of an expert on how to manage and lead remote teams. In this very, very strange and different time, it can be disconcerting about how do you lead and manage remote teams. And we were asked to do a webinar on this exact topic. So we're hoping this is really helpful for you, because one of the things that is necessary is not only managing your teams to develop their tools, their approaches, and their ways of working, but also how to lead in this new time. Leading virtual teams can be one of the most wonderful things that you can do. And we hope this webinar will give you the tools, the approaches, and some of the technologies that you might need to actually do exactly that. I hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome. I hope you're all safe and coping through this extraordinary time. And I want to welcome you to this webinar on virtual leadership, engaging and managing remote teams. This webinar is really in two parts. We're going to spend the first half hour talking through the early stages of building and establishing a remote team. And then the second half, really speaking to the tools and processes you need to make those teams truly productive in the long term. For many of you, this is a new phenomenon, where your team or teams have been with you in a physical office forever. Maybe your company doesn't have a remote work policy, or only does so with great exception. Or maybe you've been starting to consider some of these policies, but are now being pushed hard and fast into them with this global pandemic crisis. This webinar is meant to provide you with some of the helpful tips that might enable you to start and implement a new remote work process in the best way possible. So, let's get to it. And the first part we need to acknowledge is this is not our older brother's remote work. Now, of course, remote working has been around for as long as work has been around. What's really the artificial construct, quite frankly, is the 8-hour workday where we all commute out to the suburbs and pile into a large steel box called a corporate headquarters. It was, ironically, due to another global crisis that telecommuting began to see the light of day. It was the oil crisis of 1973. OPEC's oil embargo had begun, and meanwhile the word gridlock had entered the national conversation. In short, traffic, pollution, and the price of oil was creating headlines of a traffic apocalypse, a crisis. And in the 1970s environment, Jack Nils, a NASA engineer, attempted to solve this problem, and he introduced us to the word telecommuting. But he didn't mean it like we mean it today. See, of course, telecommuting in those days was pre-internet, so it was actually the idea to break up companies' headquarters into small satellite offices all over a city so there'd be less commuting, and we'd connect them via some smart computer network. Basically, they were talking about what we might call today a WeWork center or something like that. As they said in their publication, in order to make this work, the jobs employees will have to be redesigned so that they can still be self-contained at each location. Or a sufficiently sophisticated telecommunications and information system will need to be developed to help employees act as if they're centrally located. Well, as it turns out, both ideas came true. Personal computers gave an explosion in the 1980s to the idea of telecommuting, and it took off. IBM was one of the pioneers here, actually installing computers into their workers' houses. And then, of course, the revolution of the internet, and specifically streaming media, has really accelerated the whole idea of working remotely. Now, instead of telecommuting in, we can virtually be there. Our presence, video, voice, etc., it's all there. The idea being that companies could save money and achieve better productivity by simply allowing the appropriate professionals to work anywhere they have an internet connection. But then, ironically, as we look back, the whole idea of full-time remote work really cooled down somewhat in the last 5 years. The idea of the WeWork remote offices, the thriving economy, and certainly trends by, yeah, you guessed it, IBM, who really ramped down their remote work programs in 2017 in favor of working together in cool office spaces, have really slowed the idea of remote work down. But employees, well, we still love it, and we demand it. In 2015, 50% of employees said flexibility to do remote work was a top perk for any job. And the demand for it has been growing and growing and growing. So all of this was coming to a head anyway, with companies and employees trying to figure out how to make remote work work. And then, well, we all know what happened. COVID-19 happened. You see, today is different. It's not about flexible hours. It's not about doing a bit more on your laptop when you get home or checking email on your tablet before bed. It's not leaving early to beat traffic and jump online when I get home for a couple hours. No. This is full-time remote team management. It is virtual leaders managing a remote team full-time. Whether they're full-time freelancers or employees, this is your team. It's just managed remotely. Now, the point to all of this is before we begin to look at best practices, we have to acknowledge that whether you're just starting this adventure or are looking to expand it in your business, it's not the same as the remote, flexible work that we've been slowly moving toward for the last decade. This, today, 2020, is different, even for those remote workers that have been doing this for a while. Understand that even if you have work-from-home team members now, this is more a work in isolation situation. Today's seasoned remote workers are used to being in coffee shops, airports, or working in their home offices uninterrupted, and have largely architected their lives, as we'll certainly learn about in a moment, around habits, tools, and behaviors that enable them to be productive anywhere they have an internet connection. In the world that we're in right now, we have remote work in isolation. In many cases, there is no going to the coffee shop. The kids and spouses are home with the worker. Behaviors and habits are thrown into complete chaos. Add to that another complication, which is, as business owners or management teams, we've been resistant to this idea. We often make an assumption that, sure, people are very glad to work from home, and we assume they would prefer to work remotely. And so we have this mental impression of our team goofing off in their PJs and barely getting any work done with no supervision. This is a false assumption. Many of your team members are intimidated by work from home. Many have never done it before, and so they don't have the home office set up. They haven't established behaviors and habits. They are not looking forward to this one little bit. And with both of those scenarios in mind, we get to our first best practice, which is establish new training and implement remote work carefully. So the first thing we want to acknowledge as virtual leaders is we need to establish new rules of productivity for the short term. As my colleague Kathy McKnight likes to say, "Yay, we get to change," said no one ever. One of the best pieces of advice I can tell you, and it's why we make this first, is that you want to position this as a new approach to working, not a change to their existing workflows, processes, and ways of working. In our 10 years of working with organizations, we've just learned that one of the hardest things to change about a way a business and teams working within it work is to change existing methods of working. Instead, if we look to make this additive, in other words, position your messaging to your teams and your colleagues as this new remote work approach, and it will be an added new way for us to be productive. It can be very helpful for those who are familiar with remote work to adjust in this new way, and it can be an easier adjustment for those who are not familiar and intimidated by this new work arrangement to feel more comfortable about learning it. The value of your work does not and should not diminish because of the medium in which you do it. So, working remotely should be just as critical, just as valuable, and just as useful as physical work. It's just different. It's new. It seems like a subtle, but it's a very important distinction. It will certainly help you establish new ways of working, especially if you're going to go back to the old ways of working. So, some specific things you may want to do. Now, you may have already established your prepare to work from home materials and notes to your teams, but to the extent you can, start thinking about these best practices. 1, Be proactively transparent. Just live with the fact that you're going to see a reduction in communication. Again, your team may be new or they may be adjusting to life at home and trying to work. Your current corporate culture may be, yeah, we'll tell you anything you want to know. Just ask or find someone. But here, with your team, it's really important that you don't let imaginations or side conversations rule the day. Address any tough conversations and content right up front. Build trust in your communications and content right from the beginning. Be proactively transparent. 2, establish training, or you might call them socialization programs. Now, whether you design them as yourself or you bring in a coach or a trainer, invest the time to help your team adjust to this new world. It doesn't have to be a college-level curriculum or anything like that. I mean, after all, you've got work to get done. But invest in your team to help them understand the new tools and how they might redesign their behaviors, set up their home offices, etc., etc. 3, maintain the existing hierarchy in relationships. It's going to be very tempting because everyone is remote to simply invite everybody to every meeting, especially if you're trying to be proactively transparent like we just talked about. Or because now email and or Slack or some other digital channel is our main communication channel, it's just as easy to CC or dash off an email to leadership when it might not have been as easy before or even called for. And that's the key, maintaining those hierarchical and relationship things so that we actually respect the time and the way that work went. And that brings us to 4, which is establishing more iterative workflows and check-ins. And again, whether you bring in a coach to help with this or you are already exploring some of the new, more agile or sprint ways of working, one key will be to establish shorter, smaller tasks and more frequent check-ins. Both as a leader and a team member, the natural tendency here will be to issue clear direction and feedback for the team as you've been doing. In a remote work environment, this can often, however, mean that you're writing really long emails or having really long conference calls. This can not only slow you down, but it can cause real fatigue. If you start to establish a pattern of a weekly email, for example, that's 3,000 words long to your team, setting expectations, telling them what they should be working on the week, guess which email is going to be the most hated email in the world after about 3 weeks? Rather, establish a new workflow for projects and implement more frequent check-ins based on tasks completed. Yeah, this means more communications, but it means shorter, more effective communications. For example, when my team is working on a big consulting or content deliverable, there may be 3 or 4 of us working on it at any one time. Someone may have taken the first shot at it, but as we move to the more collaborative process, we assign tasks and check in daily or even twice a day to monitor progress. Check in, even if it's just to say, I'm still working on it. And that brings us to our next best practice, and that is to manage the work, lead the worker. As we discussed, this is a different kind of remote work. And because of that, productivity may certainly suffer in the short term, or it may not, quite frankly. You may be blessed to have a team that wants to immerse themselves into the work and truly shut out the outside chaos. In either case, however, as you start leading remote teams, natural patterns are going to start to emerge for people as they adjust to this new world. The key is to grow as a leader and leverage this to your advantage where possible and to accommodate it where it isn't. You see, in the work from home, remote work scenario, you have to get beyond the old notions of time and task. There really is no such thing as staying late or putting in the hours. Availability is going to be put to the test already as time zones and, quite frankly, life gets in the way of your remote teams. Now, there are exceptions to this, for sure. I mean, I understand if some of you are managing customer or client support service teams that have to be available for certain specific hours of the day, or there are certain confinements of hours as what it is you provide. But what we're talking about here are those patterns and those teams that are not confined necessarily by the pattern of a physical clock. You know what I mean, the regular 8 to 5 schedule with a break at noon to 1 for lunch for everybody, and then everybody gathers from 2 to 4 for the all-hands meeting or the training on the new HR policies, etc. These are all the patterns that are going to be immediately shattered by remote work. They should not be duplicated in the remote work scenario. In the long term, savvy remote workers integrate their work life into their home life. They may work all day Sunday, but then take their kids to the park on Monday morning. As a virtual leader, one of the things you're going to want to be mindful of is A, establishing clear rules of the road and or flexibilities for work times and patterns, and B, monitoring your team members as they adjust and begin to learn their patterns and adjust or correct them as your workflows depend on it. For example, you may have someone who operates in what I call offline mode. They go quiet. They don't respond to email or Slack messages or text all day. Then, at 4:30 p.m. every day, you get a flurry of emails, Slack messages, document dumps into the shared repository with status updates responding to every little thing. And this leaves the rest of the team with little time to respond before the end of their day, and it can be quite frustrating for those who are trying to actually work a normal day. Now, our normal inclination is to set the rules, to say everybody has to work 8 to 5, be at your desks, be responsive to messages, and be on every call. And doing this is a quick way to build an unengaged remote worker. What we want to focus on here is the work. Is the work being done smoothly? Then ask, what behaviors do we want or need to change in order for the work to be done more productively? See, on the positive side, we want the work done. So if somebody can accomplish that in 2 hours and then take their kid to the park, that should be okay. If someone is dumping work at midnight because they really love to work from 6 to midnight, maybe that's okay, maybe it's not. Ask yourself if you can leverage that idea to meet your workflow. Some of these new patterns might actually work to your advantage. So some specific things to do. 1, establish rules of the road for the work. Now, this may be difficult at first, but it will be well worth the effort. As a team, have a discussion about limitations, flexibilities, and preferences for working remotely. As you set up your meeting schedules, your projects, your work streams, figure out which need to be regimented for smooth flow of the work and which can be flexed or leveraged based on unique patterns or preferences from your team. Here's a great example. My team lives in Portland, Toronto, and Germany, and I live in Los Angeles. I absolutely leverage the time zone differences for projects we work on to give us a leverage on hours in the day from Europe to the US, from the East Coast to the West Coast. However, our team meetings are always the same time. Early in the morning for West Coasters, middle of the day for East Coasters, and early evening for the Europeans. We've separated out how we work on projects, which is really flexed to time certain things like team meetings, which happen all the time at the same time. Number 2, establish boundaries for teams. These teams that need to not necessarily be work-based, but communication and expectation-based. Just because you can email or Slack or text someone at 6 a.m. their time and 8 a.m. your team's time does not necessarily mean you should expect a response. Additionally, PTO, like paid time off, is time away. It does not mean something different now that your team is remote and at home. Also, resist the urge to the extent you can, even when it's beneficial for you to make these personal, to do boundaries that are personal. You might say something like, well, okay, everybody except Mary is cool with getting emails on weekends. No. Establish those boundaries for the teams, not the people within the teams, to the extent you can. 3, care less about 9 to 5. I don't mean care or not care at all. I mean care a little less about 9 to 5. Generally speaking, unless your business warrants it, consider not caring about when you're in the office and when you're working kind of thing. This goes beyond simple availability and goes to things like multitasking or social media or surfing Reddit, whatever it may be. This doesn't mean that you shouldn't institute time-spent technologies like time tracking for project management or accountability, especially if you're in the business of billing by the hour or if you want to create data that measures effort. But if you're considering things like keylogger technology or tracking people's behavior with software as a means of quote-unquote managing them, you should think good and hard about that, because that says more about your culture and the longevity of your team than it does about actually getting more work done. And that brings us to the final best practice for this first half, which is establishing your remote technology stack. Now, for many of you, there's not going to be a lot of choice here. You may be working with your corporate IT, or candidly, they may be working very hard right now at acquiring the right technologies that can help you manage and lead and work with remote teams. The key, however, is to establish standards here and protocols around the way that you use the technology. This is one of the hardest things to do, I'll tell you, and everybody has old habits that are going to be hard to break. For example, right now, you may collaborate on documents in the physical office by simply passing them around on email, and you can pop by somebody's cube and go, "Hey, can you email me that latest version?" But when remote, you may have someone work on a document and say, "Hey, the latest version's on the SharePoint server or Dropbox." And then you have someone else email and say, "Hey, here's the latest version of the document and as an attachment to the email." And yet somebody else pass you the link through a text message on your phone to the document and the message itself. The same is true for online messaging. What are your protocols for what text messaging is used for versus Slack versus Skype versus Zoom or GoToMeeting or Microsoft Teams? They all have overlapping features. Make sure that you get the right one so that everybody expects content and messaging and communication in exactly the same way. As an example, we manage our current team remotely using GoToMeeting for all of our video and teleconferencing, so online meetings. Now, I'll also tell you that we're using Evernote to take notes for clients. Things like interviews or stakeholders or clients or meeting notes, Evernote is our go-to there. Everybody takes their notes in Evernote, and we use shared spaces as a means of sharing those notes. OneNote, by the way, is also very good at this if you're going full Microsoft. We've tried to reduce the text messaging idea as much as we can, though it's really difficult because it's really easy to get somebody's attention that way, and we use Skype for instant messaging. Now, this is likely to change for us down the road as well, but it works well for the moment. And Skype is what we typically use if we're making one-to-one outbound calls, or we just need to quote-unquote jump on the phone for a quick conversation. We use Dropbox for our shared document and asset repository, WordPress to manage our websites and online client community, and of course Pro Workflow to manage our projects. We have decided on standards and the ways to use these products as a means of communicating and keeping collaboration going fluidly. So again, the specific vendors are much less important here than establishing the protocols for your team and ensuring that people use them as they're supposed to be used. So, some specific things you can do here. 1, understand the limits of your team. Beyond collaboration, you've got to have a good grasp on your team's current limits, from cellular coverage to Wi-Fi access to the hardware they use, desktops versus laptops versus tablets versus iPhones versus Android devices, and all of the software that you're going to need to utilize. 2, with those limits in mind, build your IT tech stack. So work with your IT team or a consultant or someone in understanding what tools are going to be best for you to manage your team in that remote setting. Remember, there is no walking down 2 cubes and asking your office mate to open up a document that you just got because you don't have the software. You're going to think about hardware, headsets, laptops, cell phones, project management, document creation, communication software, including workflow, project management, document creation, and sharing. These things may have been enterprise tools before. Are they available outside the firewall of your business? Find out and figure out if you need to add to those capabilities. Communication tools, including video conferencing, team chat, email, note-taking, etc. And 3, don't forget the training. One of the biggest impediments to remote team management, so much so that it's become its own internet meme, is the technology challenges of online communications. From conference call and video call etiquette to how to set up the online conferencing system to how to log into the workflow tool to how to not send a 50 megabyte attachment in an email. Making sure that your team gets training and practice on how to use the technology so that everybody's really familiar with it and how to use it. And so there's not one failure point either. In other words, if there's only one person on the team that knows how to start a Zoom meeting, and if that person's not available suddenly, well, the whole thing breaks down. In conclusion, one of my mentors in business is the late Clayton Christensen, and one of the things he said I think is really important in this new world that we now live in is understanding a problem is the most crucial step in solving it. Whenever we're going through a disruptive change in the world, we really need to ask ourselves if we understand the actual problem we're solving for. It's common when we think about remote work our immediate thinking goes to how are we going to produce the work we do today and duplicate the environment we have today with these digital tools? We can't do that, of course. That doesn't stop us from trying, but we can't do that. Content is ultimately communication. And this is really what we believe in at TCA. We have a saying here that because we focus so much on what things are doing in content, that content is communication. The biggest role of a virtual team leader is communicator. One of our clients said it really well after being the remote team manager for 5 years. And she said, if I had to go back in time and relearn one thing, it's that being a remote employee, and especially the leader of a remote team, is about communicating. They should never wonder what's going on with the rest of the team. All the stuff that used to be catch up in the coffee room, hallway conversations, even the briefest of chats in the elevator, they're just not there. So if anyone is wondering what's going on, we're not living up to our potential as a team. Ultimately, we find that being a virtual team lead is getting really good at creating communication, the content that keeps your team engaged, flowing, productive, and ultimately profitable for the company. In a physical space, almost everything is shared verbally. In a remote situation, almost everything is shared via written communication. And so you've got to encourage people to get really good at creating content that communicates clearly. And you've got to be a great example of that. All right, let's move on to part 2, shall we? And let's talk about the tools and technology of leading those virtual teams for the long term. So let's continue and focus briefly on something that as virtual leaders, we're going to need to realize as our teams begin to get into this early flow and the management really starts to happen. Before we do that, let's just recognize something really quickly here. What happens at work, it doesn't really usually happen because you're at work. Chances are that even as near in the past as February of this year, for those of you who were working from central offices, when you ask people how or where do you really get work done, well, you usually get a soft laugh and they'll probably say something like, oh, I come in early, or I stay a bit late after all the meetings, or I have to schedule my time so that nobody bothers me. So much of the physical life of work has come back to back meetings. Many of my clients run creative and marketing teams at companies, and their life is simply going from meeting to meeting to meeting, trying to get any work done in the in-between times. That 1-hour meeting that hopefully adjourns after 30 minutes and the host says something like, we'll give you back some of your day back. No, time is not like some escrow deposit. You shouldn't have taken it from me in the first place. We know intellectually that meaningful work takes good, uninterrupted time. But where does that happen? Well, often these days, it happens at home. It's not uncommon for me to hear from my clients who've been fighting for remote work capabilities to do so because they can actually get work done at home. In other words, the physical office has in many ways become a work blender, blending you into meetings, institutionalized cake celebrations, raiding the conference room for meeting leftovers, and more meetings, etc. But then, wait a minute, should we expect that once we get into this flow of remote work that our teams will find all that Zen space they've been seeking and they'll have uninterrupted workspace and be able to really focus? No, not in our experience. In fact, it can be a lot worse. The trap that many new remote teams get into, especially if they start following the advice of more communications, more frequent check-ins, etc., is that they'll add that to the existing meetings. In other words, you're still sitting in back-to-back meetings, but now you have the added chore of responding to chats, Slack messages, emails while you're in those meetings. So the long-term health and productivity of a remote team is definitely not in lifting the same structure as before and making it virtual. It's rather creating some tools for you as a leader to set your team on the right foot. So let's first look at some tools that might be helpful for you as a virtual leader, and then a bit of a deeper dive into the technologies that can help you facilitate these tools and this new approach. So, as we talked about in the first half of this webinar, the main thing that a great virtual leader possesses is great communication. And for the Jerry Maguires out there, you know the ones where I'm talking about. You just need to get me in the room kind of thing, and where communication comes naturally. This may be of an easier transition for you. But others of you out there where communication might be more of a struggle, you're going to want to put some extra effort into developing good communication relationships with all the members of your team. One-on-ones are really important. And what all these tools we'll talk about here have in common is that they attempt to remove friction from communication. This is going to be the ongoing biggest challenge with leading a remote team. So any tool that you create, including all the ones we'll talk about here, is what will keep teams engaged and productive and as conflict-free as possible. So here are 5 tools that we've found to be tremendously helpful in developing team relationships for the long term. 1, writing books and classes. Yes, really. Now, this isn't to say that everybody on your team needs to be Hemingway or Shakespeare, but it is so much of what's going on collaboratively in a team environment will be shared via written communication. I've seen so much time wasted because someone at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the West Coast shares feedback or instructions on something with someone on the East Coast, and it's missing things or unclear or structured in a weird way. And so it makes the action undoable. The question the person then sends is, hey, what did you mean here? When they get up in the morning and see it for the first time. And the person on the West Coast doesn't see it, of course, until noon on the East Coast, and this can go back and forth, losing hours and days on one particular task. Get some training on written communication. Have everybody at least go through the exercise that we did as kids of how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. We've included our 2020 book list here, including some of our favorites, such as Everybody Writes by Ann Handley and the Harvard Business Review Guide to Better Business Writing, and of course 2 classics, How to Win Friends and Influence People and The Elements of Style. All of these are incredibly helpful as you start thinking through written communication. And that brings us to 2, the visual task board. Now, many of you may practice new agile-oriented workflows already, and you may be familiar with this topic. The idea of the Kanban board is quite a popular way of managing projects. But regardless of whether you actually practice agile methodologies or Kanban methodologies, a virtual and visual task board can keep the entire team informed, communicated to, especially if you're a team that's working on multiple projects at any one time. The key to a great visual task board is A, simplicity, something that provides essential information or anything that might be confusing. B, simplicity again. If there are lots and lots of projects, categorize them in some way that makes it really simple to see the current progress. C, close to delivery, an easy way to see where a project is and how close it is to being completed. Now, these visual project management communication charts can just be a visual way for the team to know where everybody else on the team is. However, you can also create a regular method to communicate status on projects as well. For example, in your regular all-team meetings, you might just have a round-the-horn update on projects. Now, the key here is that these updates are not to get into the details of the project challenges. They should rather be just a simple red light, yellow light, green light status of 4 things. 1, are things on track? 2, what is in my way, if anything? 3, do I need help? And 4, am I requesting help at this time? We've put some helpful technology resources into the slides here, as well as some good books on Kanban and visualizing projects. These are all here as links for you to go explore. Now, the third, what we call the semi-regular reflection meeting. This is one of the more productive meetings that we have, and we do it once per month to do what we call reflect. These can be great ways, by the way, to kick off personal collaboration get-togethers like a wine tasting or something fun, which we'll discuss in just a moment. But reflection meetings are where we get the team together and usually do 4 things really quickly. We go around to each one of us on the team, and 1, we name something that's going really well. 2, we ask about something that we feel might have gone better. Not a person, but a team activity. What might have gone better? A question. 3, Ask about something they have a question about, generally speaking. It can be anything. What is something that they don't know that they would like to know? And 4, they thank someone on the team for doing something that may have been outside their normal responsibility. As a leader, this can be a great way to spot challenges before they become challenges. And the output for this, and it should have an output, is something we're celebrating, or a few things, the things we're working on, the questions we're asking, and how we're getting those answers, and gratitude for those on our team. This can be a great addition to a newsletter type of program, or even part of a larger communication for you as a team lead to your colleagues or your bosses. 4, get to personal socialization, making time for connections. As a team leader, you've got to make time to do the one-on-ones with your team. That's important. But also don't forget some of the things that we can draw on from the physical environment, which is the socialization that can be so important. High Five Friday, Wine Wednesday, happy hour every day, whatever floats your boat. Big project launch Monday, whatever it is, these things can be done virtually too. And if you think about them in advance, you can usually get things like wine or food or things delivered to people's homes in time for you to have a celebration together. One other related idea here is what we call the virtual work session. One of the things you can do here is just get together in a Zoom session or a virtual meeting, turn on the video cameras, but have everybody go on mute. If somebody needs something, they can just ask someone in the room. It's like working together in the same room, just virtually. This can be really fun and good if you're working together on something that's in the final stretch of completion. And 5th, and maybe most importantly, the team charter. Now, we don't mean this to go all Sheldon Cooper from the Big Bang Theory on you. The idea is that you can work with your team to design a documented set of protocols, behaviors, and expectations that everybody can get behind. Work on in a collaborative way and define the ideas that can get done. What information will be shared? How is it shared? Etc., etc. This can be a great and symbolic way to set the boundaries and bond you as a team. And these tools then bring us to our next piece, which is the technologies that we can start to use to facilitate these tools. So we touched a bit on this in our first half of the webinar, and I wanted to go into a bit more depth here to close things out. So there are a number of technologies that will be important as you manage the remote team. And as I mentioned last time, you may have already been working with your IT team or a consultant on getting these set up or vetted in the first place. And if it's possible, what we recommend is that you go through a requirements gathering process that can help you. There are some benefits to doing this. First of all, it's going to help you meet the user and business needs and help you select a technology that fits in well with the overall technology landscape. 2, it's going to drive the change management process and position it as new and not just collect a list of features or functionality. It's about understanding the user's needs and capabilities. It's a great opportunity to connect and review the associated processes, skill sets, and governance that support and surround the technology instead of just implementing some slick new killer solution without the right processes that will severely limit the usefulness of the technology but give you a whole bunch of features that nobody will use. And then finally, it will definitely reduce the risk of over or under buying. The requirements gathering process can surface and identify gaps in what's being done today, as well as what the teams using the technology would like to be able to do with it in the future. Buying a technology that not only meets the needs of the business today will quickly fall short in the eyes of the users in the business, and in the case of complex technologies like content management systems, the company may have outgrown the technology before it's even fully implemented. That's the key. So just for your use, I've created our 7 steps for happier tech usage. And again, this isn't meant to be some drawn-out, month-long process, but whether you engage a consultant to help you do it yourself, we found this to be a great way to think about getting to a better short list of technology solutions. So we won't go through them here because it's very simple to just simply read through the slides. But basically, all of this is about how do we get to the right questions at the right time, and all of those things to select the right technology. I hope you enjoyed the webinar. And of course, we remain committed to helping you help your organization figure out how to communicate and create more remote team effectiveness efficiently and hopefully with more joy. It's a weird time, and I hope you We'll reach out if you need anything. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you so much for attending.